It's that time again. So now it's the ZX Spectrum that's getting the top 100 treatment. So for anyone who doesn't know, the ZX Spectrum is essentially a toy computer, and its die-hard fans will probably hate me referring to it as such. That was enormously popular in Britain, Spain and Russia during the 1980s. So much so they almost single-handedly built the British software industry, creating a cottage industry of bedroom coders at the time and new startups. It was initially designed to teach children about computers, but quickly became used for almost nothing but gaming and making said games. For those outside of Europe, when used as a games machine it was somewhat comparable to the ColecoVision in price range, release date and the general way the games looked, though there were many differences between those two hardwares when getting down to the nitty gritty. Anyway, with all that out of the way, onto the list itself. Beginning our top 100 we have Light Force. So when talking of shmups, you tend to find the transitionary period of the early scrolling shmups is usually kinda glossed over, with even the biggest game of this era, Xevious, rarely spoken of in a particularly glowing light, at least here in the West. This is somewhat understandable in some ways, as scrolling shmups of this era were only just starting to find their feet. The main pull of the popular arcade game Star Force, for example, was actually that you could rapidly fire the bullets. At the time this was exciting, but now, well, it's a staple of every shmup out there really, isn't it? So back to the actual game we're talking about, Light Force. As you can guess from the title, this game is heavily inspired by the aforementioned Star Force and is of this transitionary period, though it was a little late in this case. The game was an important release for Spectrum, not only for its polished take on that popular arcade game, but because it also popularised a graphical method for Spectrum that limited colour clash by moving the ships around in 8-pixel increments. It's perhaps not the most exciting shmup to revisit due to it being of this age, but bear in mind it was pretty good at the time. And it's still a reasonable diversion, truth be told. Popular Spectrum coder Costa Panayu provides another interesting gameplay idea here, with a puzzle shmup hybrid set in an isometric view. In Highway Encounter you need to protect auto-scrolling droids as they try to push an advanced weapon into the heart of enemy territory. It's very puzzle orientated, with you having to scout ahead, shooting the bad guys and moving the objects around to make it safer for your comrades to progress. A memorably original experience. Krakow is developer Gremlin Graphics' answer to Taito's popular arcade game Arkanoid, which itself had taken the gameplay of the early Atari game Breakout and added a load of cool power-ups to the gameplay and varied layouts. There's a handful of changes here, the most apparent being the switch to a horizontal layout, but there's a few differences to the enemies and their behaviour too. The best thing about Krakow though is probably just that it adapts the arcade experience of Arkanoid, which originally used a paddle controller, to better suit the joystick controls of the home, with the game incorporating a method of bat movement where it moved at different speeds depending on whether the button was pressed or not, which gives you a lot more precision than you get with the usual digital controls. On top of that, the game also has a much easier going difficulty progression and affords the player a lot of options on how the game plays too. Just a nice example of a classic idea really. Here we have a big flick screen arcade game from early in the computer's lifespan. In Scuba Dive you swim around picking up pearls and taking them back to your ship, making sure to avoid the detailed, excellently animated marine life out to make a meal out of you. The braver player can swim deeper and explore undersea caverns for bigger treasures, being sure to check their oxygen at regular intervals lest they suffocate. An original game for the time that's tricky to master but a joy to explore. Codename Map was a cool update of Atari's classic, Star Raiders. You have to scan for enemy ships and traverse the stars, shooting them down and defending vulnerable planets from attack. Here, however, you can also give orders to your own fleet of ships to block the aliens' path and slow their progress, which leads to an extra layer of strategy to the game. A classic concept, updated excellently. So this is an interesting early puzzle game that is actually thought to likely be the forefather of games like Minesweeper, which was a very widespread and popular logic puzzle game given away free with Windows. Mind Out likely spawned a multitude of copycats across DOS, and it was likely these copycats which ultimately influenced the creation of Minesweeper. Though to be honest, when going back this far and this obscure, it's often impossible to say for sure. The game is you trying to navigate from one side of a minefield to the other, without knowing which of the squares hide mines underneath them. The only indication you have is the number that appears and tells you how many mines are in adjacent squares. It's a very clever game, likely inspired by earlier puzzles found in newspapers and puzzle books and such. Graphically it's as bare bones as you can get, but the core idea is just very elegantly designed, and the game admirably always tries to add new things to the gameplay as the levels progress. One of the best sports games on the system for its time, World Series Baseball represents the sport well, has nice graphics for the time, and its gameplay mechanics are involved enough to hold the player's attention. The game is quite an underappreciated release, mainly as baseball is not very popular in the UK, but it's definitely worth giving a chance even if you're not that interested in the sport itself. And sadly, there was never any standout cricket games on Spectrum that I know of. This has you playing as a maintenance robot working on an accident-prone cargo ship. The main goal of the game is to keep the ship afloat until you reach the destination. You start off only having to worry about patching holes, but as the game progresses, new objectives are added that need to be managed, such as making sure the ship is on course and that the engines have oil. The robot can walk around the ship opening and closing doors, or teleport by using its energy, leading you to have to recharge more often. It's a smart game that really keeps you on your toes, juggling all of the different elements. This was a fun and accessible little budget 4-player strategy game with very simple makeshift graphics. The game gives everyone a pool of money to spend on soldiers, boats and catapults. The factions take turns buying and moving their troops, and if one of the factions is killed, his surviving troops fall under the victorious player's control. More money can be earned by getting one of the treasure chests and bringing it back to base. It's an early game and admittedly doesn't look like much, but was a ton of fun to play back in the day with friends. Trashman is a very fondly remembered game where you have to keep up with and fill a garbage truck. The game really has two elements, a precise navigation part, you have to stay off of the grass, and a Frogger style element where you have to cross the road without being run down. The game is timed, and if you take too long you'll lose your job. Being a garbage man is an odd idea for a game. The only thing I can think of that is comparable is perhaps Atari's Paperboy, but it's a compelling distraction if you get into it, and is very polished too, with fairly nice graphics for the year of its release. Enduro Racer was an impressive racing game for its time, ported from the Sega arcade machine. In the game you're racing against the clock along one of the worst maintained tracks in history. Some nasty piece of work seems to have even transported a bunch of boulders and dumped them in the middle of the track for you to hit. Correctly judging your wheelies as you go over the ramp sends you up into the air and over the top of these hazards littering the road. And like many of the Sega races, hitting the checkpoints refills your ever diminishing time. The jumps add an exhilarating element to the gameplay and it is a fun racer. Stage 2 specifically is frankly too difficult though, requiring memorization, but it's not a particularly long game at only 5 stages, so I guess it needs to be pretty hard. Overall an impressive title with very good scaling for the time given that it was largely programmed in '86, and actually Sega themselves seemingly didn't have the confidence to port the game to their Master System console, instead changing it to an easier to program isometric view. So it is really an impressive feat for the computer. Reportedly this Spectrum version even beat the arcade machine to release here in the UK. Here's a simple puzzle game with a good concept. In Pipe Mania the aim is to lay a series of connecting pipes fast enough to keep you ahead of an oncoming water source. The available time decreases as the levels progress, and other elements are also added to make it more complicated as time goes on. Pipe Mania was an interesting game that started out on computers like the Amiga, before being ported to just about everything. It was never the most famous or well known of puzzle titles, but was quite influential, spawning many imitators. Heck, even 2007's Bioshock actually included something similar as a hacking minigame in it. A nice underrated puzzle game all in all. The most advanced golf game from back in the day. The game gives you pretty good mechanics for aiming and striking and a lot of different clubs, as well as being one of the earliest that does wind and such well. It's a pretty intuitive game and the Spectrum version plays well and has reasonable colour graphics that are uncluttered. Somewhat like a 3D scrolling version of Snake, Fatworm Blows a Sparky is a conceptual game set inside the computer playing it. The game has you using a radar to track down spindles, while shooting at or avoiding the program bugs that stick to you and inevitably end up destroying you. Many of the spindles can only be reached by going up and down ramps and carefully navigating platforms, and the attached bugs can be cleaned by passing through the debuggers littered throughout the environment. It's a fun early 3D game and is memorable in ideas and carefully crafted in execution. Mikey was originally a Konami arcade game. This version was ported by the beloved Spectrum programmer Jonathan Smith, a man who would produce numerous quality ports and original games for the system, and whom was known for his excellent programming skills and mastery of the Spectrum hardware. Back to the game though, Mikey is a pretty simple game. You play as a student at a school collecting hearts in a variety of stages while avoiding the enemies. As always, Jonathan Smith does an excellent job porting the game, retaining the important gameplay elements and adapting the graphics to the Spectrum in a colourful and discreet manner. Unfortunately, owing to its games being made almost entirely in Britain and Spain, neither of which were big into the genre, as well as memory and media limitations, the 48K Spectrum had very few traditional RPGs on it. Fortunately, it did at least get this early release though, a clone of one of the most important RPGs ever made, Ultima. The game has all the hallmarks of the genre. You travel around the overworld getting into random battles and accumulating experience, visit towns to buy equipment, and descend into dungeons which take place in a 3D perspective. It's basically just a Lord of the Rings themed Ultima 1, with colourful graphics and the odd new item and quality of life improvement. But it's done well, and the game actually arrived before many of the official Ultima ports would turn up too. Eliminator is a fun pseudo 3D shooter where you have to blast the insidious aliens and dodge around and over the oncoming barriers. The 3D effect is pretty good here, with some excellent undulating road effects, and it provides some exciting gameplay, with you weaving in and out, swapping from floor to ceiling and gaining new power-ups and such. For the most part, even though there's little colour here, it's pretty easy to discern what's coming up, but admittedly it can sometimes be difficult to recognise the ramps that need to be used to jump over barriers, which does lead to some problems first time around. Thankfully, a lot of the issues from the earlier 16-bit games have also been rectified here though, such as the obscuring hills and unforgiving bullet damage. Venom Strikes Back is a somewhat interesting platform game from 1988. The main interesting thing about this game is that you have to pick up and choose from a bunch of different weapons and pieces of equipment that can be utilised in different ways to help you progress through the game. Deciding what to take and what to leave, as well as when the best time to use said items is, lends some strategy to the proceedings. The game gets a bit too difficult later on, but thankfully it has another somewhat admirable element, giving you a password save that allows you to use the teleport pods at the end of the intro level to return straight to where you left off, so you don't have to keep restarting the game every time you die at these difficult sections. Save capability like this was still somewhat uncommon in NES platformers, but it was pretty much non-existent in Spectrum ones, so it's cool to see it implemented here. Jonathan Smith creates a unique game here with this early platform shooter. Cobra followed his port of Green Beret, and you can see the game's influence here. You start with just a melee attack, a headbutt, but pick up projectile weapons along the way. The aim is to kill all of the bad guys, collect all of the weapons, and get the girl. The game is tricky to control at first, but worth persevering with. It's a technical tour de force for the system, with parallax scrolling and numerous sprites on screen at any given time. Getting the machine gun and laying waste to scores of enemies was an exciting experience at the time, and Jonathan used the film license well to create a pastiche full of humour and surreal elements. This was Ocean's highly popular clone of Konami's track and field arcade game, a button-mashing sports title where you had to alternate between pressing buttons as quickly as possible, as well as timing the angles of jumps and such. Ocean slapped the title with a Daley Thompson license. He was a highly successful black English athlete of the day, but made the sprite white, leading to some criticism at the time. Well, maybe the race-swapped character of Mikey kinda makes up for it. Let's be honest here though, the Daley Thompson license was probably tacked onto the game at the last minute. The game truly is just a port of track and field really, and this issue was rectified in the sequels as well. Daley Thompson's Decathlon does the gameplay of track and field well, actually adds some more events to the lineup that weren't in the original game, and even includes the pole vault event, which didn't turn up until the game's sequel, Hypersports. This one is a methodical action-adventure game from the same people who would go on to create the Dizzy series. You're started in a small, restricted area of a castle, and every time you collect one of the keys placed around the environment, it starts up another part of the castle working, slowly granting you access to the whole map. The game was originally an Amstrad CPC game arriving in 1986, but this version didn't arrive until early 1987. Things were moving very fast at this time for the action-adventure genre, with the genre-defining Metroid just being released in Japan for the Famicom Disk System add-on, and its Western cartridge counterpart only a few months away from release at this point. But Super Robin Hood was still an interesting take on the genre for the time, and remains pretty fun. It was a reasonable success, and Codemasters actually produced a sequel to the game on the NES a few years later, which surprisingly was actually pretty decent for its price too. So this was a big game of the C64's early library, and this Spectrum port has to go down as one of the most accurate translations from C64 that ever took place for the system, with the main losses only really being the game's sound effects. Beachhead is a multi-part arcade-style game where you have to navigate boats around hazards, shoot down enemy planes with your cannons, and drive a tank across the terrain to reach the enemy base. It's a fun and varied game with some clean graphics here. Atari provided a quite influential update to their very early hit Grand Track 10 here, with them expanding on the gameplay a lot by creating more interesting tracks with jumps and animated shortcuts and such, as well as including a new upgrade system where you collect spanners during the race that give you the option to improve your car's attributes. The Spectrum release recreates the game well, with all the game's main features and 8 tracks, though some have been loosely redesigned. The crashing is a bit more fiddly than in the original, but so long as you make sure to let go of the accelerate and just rotate the car before driving off, you can easily catch up and get back into the race. Whilst admittedly not as good as the premium 16-bit Atari ST port, it handles itself well against the other ports. The C64 game ended up being buggy and ripe with exploits, and the far more expensive NES port was not released until 2 years later, by which stage the game's ideas had been improved upon many times over. The new elements serve to give the gameplay a bit more oomph, but it's still the multiplayer racing against a friend where the game really shines. So this is a rarity, an actual real-time strategy game from way back in 1987. Sure, the navigation system is so dated that it gives you finger cramps every time you play it, but I'm not complaining. No pain, no gain. So gameplay-wise, it's as simple as you can get, really. You send your little troops out to attack the cities, and each city you take can be instructed to build you more units, such as ground troops, boats, or transports. The main problem here, though, is that your cities do not automatically build units. Every time a unit is produced, you have to click on a city and tell it to make another one, and eventually you'll end up having to frantically click on 30-odd cities, one after the other, every time your latest set of troops have appeared, leading to the aforementioned finger cramps. Still, I'm always surprised by my own tendency to get caught up in this game, playing it for ages and disregarding said pain and soldiering on. I think there's just something about the main gameplay loop of these games. Building up your own army and such will never not be engrossing, no matter how bare bones it is. And to be very fair to the game, this is a very early release in the genre during its formative years. In fact, the Spectrum had a few interesting early releases in the RTS genre, one still to come on the list, and the other, Stonkers, being one of the earliest RTS games in existence, and one of the first with a context-sensitive point-and-click interface. Sadly, Stonkers won't be appearing on the list anytime soon though, as whilst very interesting, it's catastrophically buggy, but I thought it would be good to at least give it a mention here. Micronaut 1 has to have some of the smoothest 3D graphics out there for the time. Just look at it. In the game you travel around the corridors of a giant supercomputer of the future, tirelessly keeping it clear of infestation from a mutant lifeform called the Scrim, who feed on the computer's energy. Apart from this main mode, the game also commendably includes a racing mode that has you racing down the corridors against an AI opponent that can be set to a range of different difficulties. As mentioned earlier, the 3D effect was very good for the time, and it really helped to drag the player into the world of Micronaut 1. Bruce Lee is an early platform game from the underrated American developer Datasoft, who would create a bunch of interesting and influential flick-screen platformers over the years. The great thing about this one at the time was the way that the character could climb around the stages collecting the required items. It just felt a lot more dynamic than many of the other platformers at the time. The game here is quite short, but actually contains a competitive 2-player mode as well that has a second player as the bad guy whose job is to sabotage Bruce Lee, which gave the game a ton of replay value. This Spectrum version is actually really good as well, containing a bunch of different trade-offs with the earlier Atari and C64 versions, being a much faster game, higher res and having better enemy AI, but also having some minor gameplay omissions and worse colour. Overall, a cool little alternative version of the game. Motos is an arcade puzzle game where the idea is simply to push all of the other enemies off of the platform. As you play, you pick up power-ups which make you stronger or give you the ability to jump for the duration of the stage, and the main crux of the gameplay is in deciding on the wisest time to use these power-ups, making sure not to waste them unnecessarily. The programmers here excelled themselves, providing a nice and carefully coloured port of Namco's arcade game, even managing to include all of the original levels in the port as well, as opposed to the C64 port, which lamentably ended up cutting half of the game's stages, including the final screen. Another Costa Pinayi game with an isometric view. In Cyclone, you pilot a helicopter, rescue people from a natural disaster and pick up crates. Pressing the M key brings up a map to show you where to go, and you have to try to avoid the titular cyclone along the way. Cyclone is actually a sort of follow-up to the game TLL, which is also worth checking out but was a bit on the difficult side. This did a great job of polishing up the gameplay and making the whole thing a bit fairer and more accessible. This was a very popular tennis game from early in the Spectrum's lifespan, ported by Scion. I believe the game was called Tournament Tennis in the US, where it was on the ColecoVision. Matchpoint is a playable little tennis game with solid graphics that introduced many elements that would later become staples for the genre. An early platformer ported from the Apple II, Lode Runner is a clever and addictive title that, along with Manic Miner and Jumpman, was one of the major early releases of the computer era. Though Lode Runner honestly owes more to platforms and ladders games like Space Panic than its Donkey Kong-inspired brethren. The game has you climbing ladders, swinging along hand-to-hand bars and digging holes to trap the enemies or drop to lower levels, whilst you aim to collect all of the gold bars. It's an action-packed game that rewards quick thinking and improvisational puzzle solving, and it even includes a level designer. The Spectrum port also happens to be one of the best of the original versions. This was an important early arcade style game for Spectrum that's kind of like a mix of Defender and Joust. It was actually the first game to be made by the company called Ultimate, who later changed their name to the more recognisable Rareware and achieved much fanfare on consoles like the N64. And in fact, many may know this game from its inclusion in Donkey Kong 64 as a minigame. Jetpack has you picking up objects to rebuild and refuel your spaceship before taking off to the next level. Like all the best games of its era, it's a simple idea that results in some compelling gameplay. The game spawned its own comic strip in Crash magazine, and two sequels. One a great thrust-styled NES game called Solar Jetman, and the other the disappointing Spectrum game Lunar Jetman. Sacred Armour of Antiriad is a very early release in the Metroidvania subgenre, or should that be Meteriad subgenre, given that this game released at the same time as Metroid. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic world that has been sent back to the Stone Age after a nuclear holocaust. Prior to the nuclear war, one of the countries had created an advanced prototype anti-radiation power suit, but had been destroyed before putting it into use. This ancient suit now represents the only hope for humanity in a fight against alien invaders. The game has you searching for the suit, you put it on by facing forwards, and slowly fixing and upgrading it to fight the alien menace. The game is a little too easy once you've learned the layout, with most of the difficulty actually being in the preliminary section before you actually get the suit working, but it's fun while it lasts and is an important early game in the genre. Another excellent arcade port from Jonathan Smith. Terra Cresta is a vertically scrolling shmup where you collect power-ups that increase the firepower of your ship and give you the ability to split yourself into separate parts, all of which can fire independently. It's a good rendition of a great arcade game with decent colour and large easy to see bullets. I did have to drop it a few places in the list though, as there is a bug in the game which causes the enemies to disappear entirely if you die in a specific place. Quasitron is a sort of remake/sequel to the very popular C64 game Paradroid. When charged with porting the game to Spectrum, the coders wanted to change the game to make better use of the Spectrum's hardware, so they transferred the 2D graphics of the original into an isometric 3D environment. The aim of the game is to dispose of all of the other droids. You can do this by zapping them or by grappling with them. Grappling starts a minigame which, if you are successful, allows you to dismantle your opponent and use his parts to improve your own robot and take on more advanced droids on the other floors. It's an original concept that makes for a very addictive and in-depth game, with you having to read through the computer archives learning the different traits of each piece of equipment, something which makes it a little less accessible than similar titles like Ranorama, but more rewarding in the long run. Caliph is a very nice science fiction themed text adventure game with a good plot and some excellent animated colour illustrations to set the scene. Like all such games, things revolve around you typing in commands with the keyboard to solve puzzles and navigate the world. The game isn't too cryptic or difficult to navigate, and it's a good example for the genre in general. So this was one of the early commercial releases of Tetris, arriving a little under a year before the Japanese Famicom version. Anyone who knows their Tetris history knows that prior to Nintendo getting their hands on the game, a variety of different players made deals to try to get the game to the West. The main ones being the Murdochs and their company Mirrorsoft, whom produced this version. Out of these early versions, this is one of the better ones. The starting level can be chosen, players are notified of the upcoming piece, the different shapes are each colour-coded for easy recognition, there's joystick control, and there's the save ability for higher scores too. However, like all of the early Tetrises, the game only provides a hard drop. The pieces are random. From the NES version onwards, Tetris generally favours some bias against getting the same piece over and over. And it's also a little less precise than people have probably come to expect from Tetris. But nevertheless, this is an important and notable release for the game, which is still fun and worth remembering for the sake of posterity at the very least. What would become a footnote in its journey to world domination. This is a 3D shoot-'em-up sequel to the earlier Spectrum classic, Tau Ceti. Academy sees you starting out as a new recruit and has you partake in lots of mission-based blasting. You now get a bunch more customization options, with a choice of craft each with different strengths, and piles of weapons and upgrades to buy. There's even a sort of code-breaking element taken from Impossible Mission. Academy provides some excellent and reasonably fast, smooth action blasting in 3D for the system. So Xeno is a future sports game that has a simple but solid idea behind it. In the game you play as a man in control of a sort of flying disc, and the objective is to try to ram a ball into the opponent's goal. You don't get to move the disc manually though, you have to plot a course with a crosshair in real time. It's kind of like a mix between Pool and Subbuteo, I guess. The game is a lot of fun, especially with two players. There's a C64 port out there as well, but they really didn't do a very good job of it, so make sure to check out the Spectrum game first. This is a memorable licensed game based on a popular British children's animation. Trapdoor is a hard game to classify. I guess it's sort of a puzzle/cooking hybrid. Basically, your boss orders you to make him meals, and you have to work out how to prepare these meals within a time limit. Your faithful friend Boney, the skull, gives you clues on what to do. Don Priestley, the game's creator, was famous for his huge character graphic style, of which Trapdoor is a good example. This method helped him to put in a lot of colour into his games, whilst largely avoiding clash. The style fits very well with Trapdoor and recreates the look and charm of the source material very closely. This was an excellent early fighting game from Australian developers Melbourne House, a gem of a company who went on to make cult classics such as the SNES Shadowrun and a surprisingly good PS2 Transformers game, amongst many others. Way of the Exploding Fist was a premier fighting game in the mid-80s. It was a game with a large moveset and great presentation that was heavily influenced by Data East's arcade classic, Karate Champ. The Spectrum version loses a bit in presentation, but it's still a very playable experience. 3D Star Strike is an unofficial clone of the 1983 Star Wars game from Atari, from the days before they started clamping down on such copyright infringement. The developers at Real Time Games actually did a phenomenal job at recreating the 3D vector game for Spectrum, with their version not only appearing much earlier than the other ports, but also being much more accurate than most of them too. The game has 4 distinct sections lending it some variety, and follows the final scenes of the first film brilliantly. You could shoot at TIE fighters, skim the Death Star, and take part in the famous trench run all for yourself. Terramex is a humorous action-adventure game where you wander around picking up and using items to access new areas. This subgenre was kind of kick-started by the 1984 game Pyjamarama, and actually ended up becoming super popular on the Spectrum, with many different series sprouting from the initial concept. Terramex is definitely one of the more memorable ones. It has you trying to locate a scientist who's the only one who can stop a meteor crashing into the Earth and causing an extinction event. The inventory system in the game is quite well set out here, and it's a definite improvement over earlier games in the subgenre, with you able to pick up as many items as you want and navigate through them with dedicated buttons to scroll the options to the left and the right, cutting down on the amount of backtracking in the game and providing a fast and easy to use system. And another interesting element is that you actually get to choose different characters to play as, and your choice slightly changes the progress of the game. Overall, Terramex is a nice adventure to play through, with fun puzzles and a setting and characters that are memorably quirky and offbeat. Hypersports was Konami's sequel to their hit sports game Track and Field, which developer Ocean had shamelessly ported to the Spectrum as Daley Thompson's Decathlon. By this point though, Ocean had decided they wanted to go legit, and as such paid for the official license for Hypersports from Konami. They also thankfully got their stellar coder, Jonathan Smith, on the job again, and he did another great job with the game, faithfully recreating the events with some respectable colour graphics to boot. As you can guess, given it's the sequel to Track and Field, there's a lot of button mashing going on here. But there's also some more timing based events that really serve to change things up a lot and make the game more interesting. Deflector is a clever puzzle game where the aim is to reflect around a laser to destroy all of the spheres on the stage before the timer runs out. It's a clever concept that lends itself to the creation of a whole host of clever puzzle layouts. Flying Shark is a highly playable port of Toplan's vertically scrolling shmup. The game is a no-nonsense affair which has you shooting down waves of enemies and picking up power-ups to increase the power of your forward cannons. Like all of Toplan's shmups, it's the pacing, speed and polish that really makes it such a playable experience. The game's monochrome graphics do unfortunately make it tricky to see bullets from time to time, but due to the large size of said bullets, it's not game-breaking by any means, and the game remains a lot of fun. This is an excellent port of Technos' genre-defining beat-em-up, Renegade, which was one of the originators of the entire genre. The game takes place in a set of small, free-screen width areas, and the aim is to simply defeat all of the enemies, either by beating them down or, better still, knocking them off the platform. And, in fact, there's a surprising amount of strategy required to progress, with the enemies and bosses of each level having their own tactics to an extent that need to be taken into account. The Spectrum game plays well, and whilst the characters are all transparent, the game's graphics are very detailed and charming, and there's a lot of attention to detail throughout. Probably the most advanced football game on Spectrum, Eminent Hughes built on the pedigree of earlier Spectrum classics like Matchday, providing lots more options and adding modern staples like sliding tackles to the player's repertoire. A very advanced football game for the time. Gauntlet on Spectrum is a polished, though graphically somewhat minimalist port of the multiplayer dungeon exploring arcade classic. You and a friend shoot your way through armies of monsters, collecting keys and conserving health, while searching for each level's exit. The game plays well, is responsive and moves at a very good pace, using the Spectrum's capabilities pretty well for the most part. This was a very good port of the classic C64 shmup. The game is a very original shooter in which the aim is to power up and collect paint. When you fill a jar with a colour, it empties into the world, with you slowly colouring the environment. The game starts off tough with you in control of an unwieldy bouncing ball, but as you successfully get power-ups you slowly get more and more control. The Spectrum does a surprisingly good job of running the game. It scrolls pretty smoothly, and whilst not quite as good as the C64 original, it plays well and is in a higher resolution as well. This is a very playable port of Capcom's classic genre-defining top-down run-and-gun arcade game, Commando. The premise is straightforward, just run up the screen shooting everything in sight and lobbing grenades at soldiers in cover. The graphics here are admittedly ugly as sin, and the sound is minimal, though later someone actually did hack the game and add in excellent 128K music, but it importantly retains all the playability. The action is fast and responsive, all the levels are there, and it's one of the Spectrum's earliest arcade ports with smooth scrolling too. This is a brilliant little budget title that updated the Gravitar concept and offered unbeatable value for money at the time. In Thrust you navigate a spaceship through caverns trying to pick up orbs and return to the surface. The main element of the gameplay is based around the controls. The ship is affected by gravity and inertia, and you have to constantly be adjusting your thrust, careful not to crash. It's a simple idea that has a long road to mastery. A very well translated table tennis game from the arcades. Ping pong gives you 4 different moves, each assigned to a direction on the D-pad. Holding down the fire button reverses the direction of the paddle. It's a simple and elegant system that works well. Other than the gameplay, the graphics here are smooth, clean and colourful, admirably with very little colour bleed. This was a cleverly constructed puzzle game where the aim was to shift the tiles around the screen to build the faces of famous personalities of the time. On top of fighting against the clock, bombs sometimes appear and need to be thrown out before they explode. The game requires some strategy. It's best to work on a picture from the bottom up and leave 2 tiles in the upper right corner to help with ejecting unwanted items, for example. And it requires a lot of quick thinking to succeed. One of the more original and enduring puzzle ideas. So this one is a fighting game where 3 martial artists vie for the championship belt. Like most of the early fighting games, International Karate Plus matches are based around points for knockdowns, not decreasing your opponent's health bar. The game was one of the greatest fighters of its era on C64, and whilst a bit downgraded, the Spectrum version retains the playability of the original. The graphics are low-key, but are clean and carefully put together. This is a pretty good port of the popular and influential American computer RPG. You have to explore a town in first-person perspective, getting into random battles and visiting shops and pubs and such, looking for dungeon entrances and buying equipment. The game had an advanced character creation system for its time, with some imagination put into the different character classes. The Spectrum doesn't have many RPGs, but it does have a good port of an important release here. This was a fun early scrolling platformer where you play as a secret agent running across train carriages. Surprisingly, the game was programmed by Hudson Soft, probably the only Japanese company to make games for the Spectrum. They actually released a handful of titles, including an excellent Pang precursor called Bubble Buster, and even a very early version of Bomberman that predated even the NES version. Owing to its age, the game is quite simplistic. This really is from the dawn of scrolling platformers, but it's a fun title with nice art design and is possibly my favourite of the pre-Super Mario Bros. Games in the subgenre. On top of that, it's also one of the earlier cases of character-based movement on the system, a method that would later grow in popularity with the release of Light Force and the later work of Dave Perry and Don Priestley. This was an optimal port of Konami's arcade game. Wetclamans is smooth, has some well-judged, discreet use of colour and controls like a dream. Again, the game is a racing title where the only real opponent is the timer. When it hits 0, the game is over. Passing across checkpoints refills it. A very polished title overall. The programmers at Elite did a pretty good job with this port of the top-down run-and-gun arcade game. Though predictably ugly, unlike some of the other home ports such as the notorious NES port, this actually controls well, including a hold button that locks the direction of fire, allowing an experienced player to move and fire independently, which is really important in a game like this. The game itself has 1 or 2 players walking up the screen shooting at the enemies and throwing grenades, much like the game Commando. One especially cool element at the time was that you could commandeer a tank and go on a rampage of destruction. A fun blaster that really shines when played cooperatively with a friend. Konami's early platform game was blessed with some great home ports, with the C64, Spectrum and later NES games all turning out very well. This version was handled by the ever-dependable Jonathan Smith, and he managed an accurate port that included all of the original stages and just enough tweaks to optimise it for Specky, giving it a bit of its own personality. The game is somewhat of a precursor to run and gun games. Most of the time you just have your trusty knife, but every now and then you'll pick up flamethrowers and bazookas to unload on gangs of baddies. A frenetic experience where you're constantly scanning for the next oncoming foe. This is a brilliant early 3D style game. It even scrolls and has a manually changeable camera view. You have to use a radar scan to search through an abandoned city for your loved one and then bring them back to safety, throwing grenades at giant ants along the way. The game is another pretty influential title as well, being said to be one of the main inspirations for 1984's Night Law. It has piles of atmosphere and still plays quite well for such an old and original title. It's also arguably one of the first ever survival horror games, with it fitting the definition much better than just about any of its contemporaries. Surprisingly and ironically, its main problem is actually also somewhat tied to the survival horror genre. The game uses tank controls, which can be quite imprecise and difficult to deal with when under stress. This is an interesting adaptation of Konami's NES game from the team who would go on to make Earthworm Jim. The game is a platformer where you explore a top-down overworld with points that lead to side-view platforming levels where you fulfill objectives and find items. This version feels like a more forgiving, mini version of the NES original. It starts out vaguely following the layouts of the NES game, but starts to veer off more as the game goes on. The combat is admittedly far less dynamic here than in the NES game, to say the least, but most of the brutal jumping sections that the original has become notorious for have also been removed, and it's a much easier and more accessible game as a result. In fact, if anything, this version is a little too easy. The title is well programmed and has some impressive graphics for Spectrum, with very little colour clash and even some parallax scrolling included, which the original game did not have. And unlike many of the other later era Spectrum games, it all fits into 48K too. And it's really nice to have the full run of all of the areas at your leisure in such an explorable game, without having to worry about the constant loading and reloading from tape. This is the first game on the list from one of the most notable Spectrum coders of all time, Julian Gollop, who was known for his clever and imaginative turn-based strategy games, of which he produced many on the Spectrum throughout its lifespan. He would go on to gain much fanfare in the strategy community with the very popular XCOM series of games. Julian Gollop went in a slightly different direction here with his sequel to his immensely popular strategy game Chaos. The foundation of Chaos is still here. It's a single or multiplayer game where wizards take turns in casting spells and summoning creatures to fight each other, but Lords of Chaos adds in a bunch of RPG elements and customization, as well as a proper single-player campaign mode. And more missions were also added later with the release of expansions. The game isn't quite as accessible as Chaos, but the changes to it make for a very different experience. Unfortunately, the Spectrum ports of Konami's shmups turned out pretty poor for the most part. Thankfully, the company Hewson came to the rescue with their own excellent Gradius-inspired game here with Synapse. The shmup has a similar power-up system to Gradius, but with some tweaks to work on a one-button controller. If you pick up one of the power-ups, it just advances the selection box by one, whereas if you're holding down fire when you pick it up, instead you'll gain the highlighted power-up. Some weapons, such as the front guns and the bombs, can be powered up more than once as well. Everything about the game is very polished. The power-ups are pretty cool, with the homing shot, hold down fire, being tricky to use at first but rewarding to master. The scrolling is pretty smooth, and there's even some impressive boss fights too. I'd say avoid the other ports of the game though, as they have a range of different issues. Starquake was an action-adventure game from Stephen Crow, a programmer who tended to take concepts originated by Rare and expand upon them. Starquake was his most original and enduring title in my opinion. The game has you playing as an alien named Blob as he sets down on an unstable planet that's ready to blow at any time. The only way to stop this catastrophe is to find the items needed and take them to the planet core to stabilise it. Blob has the unique ability of being able to create temporary platforms to stand on, and can also ride on a special floating platform if he can find it. The game starts off daunting, but perseverance really pays off, and as soon as you've found the planet core you can make a note of its closest teleport terminal's password, and from then on can always teleport straight there. The game is a fast and furious experience that really grows on you over time. This was a very polished action-adventure game, with the emphasis being on the action, which was based on the popular British comic character of the 1950s. The aim is to search the environment for bombs, pick them up and take them to a bomb disposal room. Each time you do this successfully, the game opens up a door and gives you access to a new area to search. The enemies stay dead after being shot, so it's actually wisest to just make sure that you clear them from each area before moving on. The game is much more accessible than many of the other Spectrum adventure titles, as it's mainly just about shooting and platforming. You get more than enough time to learn each section before new areas are added, and there's no lives either. Instead, there's a time limit, and every time you're captured, the time decreases. It's a fun game, and the graphics were definitely some of the best for its day, with it being one of the pioneering games for the system that used foreground objects to avoid colour clash, and using dithering to give the appearance of more colours. The Great Escape is an original isometric adventure game, very loosely based on a famous prisoner of war movie. It has very little in common with it, really. The game has you trying to escape from a prison camp by using items you find throughout the camp. Everything needs to be planned out in advance, as you need to go through your daily routine and show up for roll call and such. If you don't touch the controls, the game actually automatically takes you through this routine. If you don't do this, the prison guards discover that you're up to something. It's an ambitious game with lots of atmosphere, and is generally pretty fair too, though one necessary item requires you to have the eyes of a hawk. Great game, and a real benchmark for the genre. This was a great arcade port from Elite Systems of the playable little platform game made by Tecmo. In the game you jump from platform to platform or glide by tapping the button, collecting bombs and avoiding the enemies. Responsive controls and precision gliding were always the game's main strength, and they were transferred to the Spectrum excellently, along with some carefully designed, detailed and clean background graphics. I actually played this version of the game way before ever experiencing the arcade original, and when I found an arcade machine of the game, I was actually pleasantly surprised that I just blasted through it because it played exactly the same as the Spectrum game. It was actually that similar. This is a pretty good port of the all-time C64 classic. For anyone unfamiliar with the game, in it you run and jump your way through a flick-screen maze, avoiding robots and searching objects for puzzle pieces that are used to decrypt a password. This version is lacking a bit in presentation compared to the original, but it's still colourful without being messy and very much retains its classic and unique gameplay. Ranarama is kind of like Gauntlet mixed with RPG elements like spell acquirement and upgrades. You play as a wizard who's been turned into a frog, and the aim is to search for evil wizards and clear them out of each level of the dungeon in turn. This is done by leaping on top of them and completing a minigame. If successful, they drop runes which can be used in the shops to upgrade your defense, offense and health, as well as purchase a variety of different spells. When the floor is done, it gets dimmer and you need to move on. A very original and addictive game. Mercenary is a good port of the wireframe 3D adventure game, which was originally on the Atari 8-bit computers. The game has you crash landing on a planet that you need to explore, either on foot or by plane, carrying out missions and progressing the story. It makes for a pretty engrossing experience and does a great job of creating a large world to explore. The game does have some labyrinthine sections, so I'd recommend that you draw out some maps yourself to help you along, to stop you from getting too lost. After a string of fun arcade-style games, Attic Attack marked Rare's first foray into action-adventure games, a genre they would stay with for the rest of their time on Spectrum. The game is an influential top-down flick-screen game where the aim is to escape a haunted mansion by collecting 3 parts of the ACG key. Being such an early release in the genre, the gameplay is fairly simple. Find all the coloured keys and open every door you can find until you come across the 3 parts of the main door key. Then dump the coloured keys, grab the 3 parts and leave through the front door. As a secondary goal you can work out which items deal with the 4 legendary monsters in the mansion, but it's not required. The game was an important pre-Zelda release in the genre and is, after a preliminary bout of being lost before you get your bearings, still quite a fun and easygoing action game overall. This is an odd and highly original first-person puzzle game where the aim is to avoid the gaze of the sentinel while slowly teleporting yourself up to the top of the mountain, at which point you can absorb the sentinel and move on to the next level. This is another game that has piles of atmosphere, with a sort of solemn and eerie feel permeating the whole experience. For anyone not familiar with the title, SimCity is a simulation game where you build your own city, placing the roads, houses and power stations and such, and raise income every year from taxation, attempting to balance the happiness of your population. The game was originally a 16-bit computer release, but somehow the programmers here have managed to fit almost all of the game into Speccy. A real impressive feat for the system, and it plays as well as ever. Here's yet another impressive early 3D game for the system. This time it's the racing game classic Stunt Car Racer, ported from the 16-bit computers. You race against an AI opponent around the crazy roller coaster-esque courses, trying to stay on the track whilst rocketing up ramps and over gaps, being careful not to go too slow and fall down or go too fast and fly into the air and smash yourself to pieces on landing. It's a fun and exciting game for the time, and the Spectrum handles it all surprisingly well, with a fairly consistent speed throughout and a frame rate that may not look great but was pretty good in the context of the time, truth be told. The Activators is a puzzle game where you control a team of bomb disposal robots. The game involves moving your team around a building, finding computer chips to repair the building's functions. This allows you to get hold of all of the bombs and throw them out before they explode. You avoid bad guys, problem solve, and throw the bombs from robot to robot to achieve your objectives. It's a smart, well thought out and fun game. One of the first fully formed action-adventure games, Pyjamarama was the pioneering second game in the Wally Week series. The game has you navigating one of Wally's fevered dreams in an effort to wake him up in time for work. It carried on its forebear's mechanic of picking up objects and taking them to where they were required, but made this now centred around puzzle solving, with each correctly placed object opening up a new area in the environment. The simple two-screen levels of the original were also replaced with a large non-linear mansion to explore, filled with surreal touches and odd foes. The Dizzy and Magic Knight series especially owe a lot to this early gem. Never-Earth is a real-time strategy game where you build robots that you can order to take bases or attack the enemy. Each base you take adds more specialised resources to your resource pool to build more robots. The game is a pioneering title for the real-time strategy genre. The Mega Drive game Herzog's Way is often talked about as the first RTS game, but Never-Earth here shows that there was already at least some movement in the genre previously. In fact, there's a few similarities between how the Herzog series and Never-Earth function that make me kind of wonder if there was some influence going on. But to be honest, it's difficult to think of a scenario where the developers of Herzog would have come across Never-Earth. Given it is such an early game, the AI can be a little clunky at times. Bear in mind that the electronics module does improve your robot's AI though, but this does little to offset the game's overall significance. An interesting release for the Spectrum. The most in-depth of strategy games on Spectrum, and one of the standouts of its genre from the 80s. Vulcan has you taking part in the North African campaign of World War II. It's a turn-based strategy game where you move your troops around strategically to take or hold areas. The game was one of many excellent strategy games on Spectrum made by R.T. Smith, a man who would later go on to becoming an important contributor to much of the Total War series. One of the highest selling, or possibly the highest selling game in Britain during the 1980s, Robocop reportedly stayed in the sales charts over here for over a year. The game itself is a methodical run and gun title with a variety of mini-games interspersed between the levels. It was a collaborative effort between Ocean, who bought the film license very early, and the Japanese company Data East, with the two joining forces with each other and working on the arcade and home computer releases simultaneously. The graphics in the game are detailed and well animated, and actually there's also some debate as to whether they purposefully use a trick with dithering patterns to take advantage of the lower quality RF output of the Spectrum to get more colour into the image without clash, which would be interesting if true, but I don't think it's ever been corroborated. Certainly patches of blue and yellow interference appear when played on original hardware, but it's difficult to tell if they're deliberate or not. Either way, the game is smooth, polished and quite varied. It actually follows the movie pretty well too. Fairlight is another isometric adventure game, this time arriving in 1985 and representing a very ambitious title for the year. The game offered much more fleshed out storytelling and item manipulation than prior games, with you able to move and hoard objects around the map, permanently trap the enemies and hold on to health potions for later use. There were even limits to what you could carry that were based on the actual weight of the objects. The game's puzzles are unfortunately sometimes obtuse and nonsensical, leading to some frustration, but in a world where Zelda is often heralded as the originator of all things action-adventure, the importance of games like Fairlight cannot be allowed to be forgotten. The Dizzy games were a series of action-adventure titles where you played as the titular hero Dizzy, as he navigated tricky platforming jumps and solved puzzles by picking up and using objects. This series was actually huge in Europe at one stage, leading to the original game to have countless sequels and spin-offs. This, the third game in the main series, added a bunch of improvements, the main one of which was improved item management and a bigger focus on story and humorous dialogue, with Dizzy being joined in the game by his family, the Yoke Folk. The game is funny, intuitive and is a title that is full of charm. God, I love this hot mess of a game. Just look at the chaos of that juddering scrolling and those absurd screen-filling weapons. Midnight Resistance was an impressive later arcade port for Spectrum that was just filled with set pieces and over-the-top action and weapons. The game was a run-and-gun title where you blast through the stages in an orgy of destruction, collecting dropped keys. These keys are then used at the end of the stage to buy weapons and ammo. The Spectrum is really pushed to the max with this game, resulting in it feeling a bit clunky and unwieldy at times, but it's a lot of fun when you've grown accustomed to it, and it actually also provides something very different to the arcade original. The new, chunky art design and much slower fall rate give the port a very different style and feel, resembling more of a sort of proto-Metal Slug than the Contra-influenced arcade original. Chase HQ was an excellent port of the Taito arcade game, where you chase down criminals before the timer ran down and then run them off the road. The game is a tense racer whose gameplay is replicated on the Spectrum much better than most would have thought possible. It actually nails the feel of the game better than most versions on more powerful systems. The programmers very clearly went the extra mile here. This is an early action game for Spectrum, heavily inspired by the speeder bike sections of the then recently released Return of the Jedi, a scene of which it does a great job of recreating. The concept is simple: shoot the two bikers whilst avoiding the trees. Each level gets more and more manic as it adds more trees to avoid. The game is Twitch gaming at its finest and hooks you in to such an extent that the outside world can disappear as you focus on nothing but the game and its huge lineup of trees coming towards you. Somewhat overshadowed on release by Manic Miner, Chucky Egg was every bit the classic platforming experience of its famous rival. Where Manic Miner went for humour, puzzling and unique environments, Chucky Egg was all about the fast and responsive gameplay, with the player having an unmatched level of control for the time. Fall damage was frustratingly ubiquitous in platformers of the day, but not so for Henhouse Harry, who could leap across the screen bouncing from platform to platform with no fear of breaking his ankles at all. The superlative control and lack of fall damage really made for a more dynamic platforming experience than the competition. The game has you collecting eggs and avoiding birds for the first run of stages, but memorably has the big bird burst out of his cage and relentlessly pursue you for the second lot of stages. Still an accessible title that remains a lot of fun. Definitely the early Rare's most important release, Night Law was a highly influential and revolutionary isometric adventure game where the aim was to explore the non-linear world doing platforming feats and solving puzzles to collect specified items that needed to be brought to a central cauldron room. Due to a curse, you become a werewolf during the night, and this affects the way in which the enemies react to you. The game not only expanded on titles like Sega's Congo Bongo, transferring many of the 2D platforming mechanics into an early pseudo-3D environment, it also pioneered many staples of the action-adventure genre too, and provided a clever marriage of the two gameplay types that would inspire a raft of imitators and its own subgenre. Like many revolutionary games, the gameplay is very rough around the edges, but I'm of the opinion that Night Law and its later isometric brethren probably don't get the deserved credit for setting the stage for much of the early 3D platformer era on later consoles like the N64. It's also interesting to note that both this and its successor Alien 8 gained cartridge release in Japan for the MSX computers, so the game did certainly travel. Myth follows a struggle against an evil time-travelling demon named Dameron. The old gods require a champion to fight him, but are limited only to humans who believe in them, a scarcity in the 20th century. Luckily they managed to find such a person and send the kid back in time. The game is an action-adventure title where you solve puzzles in different eras. Clues are printed in the manual, so make sure to read through it, otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. Fight mythical monsters and collect orbs which spawn a teleport icon that transports you to the next level. Already a popular game on the C64, when ported to the Spectrum, the developer thankfully decided to make a completely new game only loosely based on the original, that would be custom made for the Micro. This decision allowed them to make one of the most graphically impressive, atmospheric and polished games on the computer, with huge monsters and lots of variety. The complex control system takes some getting used to, but is well worth persevering with. After porting Technos' arcade classic, Renegade, Ocean found themselves with a popular license and the option to create sequels themselves. Now generally when European companies make sequels to Japanese games, the results are pretty dire, see Strider or Bombjack for example, but in this case they managed to retain the essence of the original title whilst developing the gameplay and adding a new flavour of their own, with the title actually infused with a more British feel to it, akin to the British crime movies of the 70s. With it taking place across multi-storey car parks, pubs with Lenny McLean lookalikes, and parks filled with punks and skinheads. The Amstrad version of the game was also very good, but had none of this style, instead going for a theme more in common with American TV shows. And where the other versions of the game are concerned, it's best not talk about them really. The game is a beat 'em up where you walk from left to right fighting gangs of enemies. Every time the enemy count goes below 3 you can advance. You get a variety of moves, punches, grabs, flying kicks, back kicks and the ability to attack downed opponents, as well as a welcome 2-player co-op. It kinda feels like the missing link between Double Dragon and Streets of Rage at times, and actually holds its own quite well with the big beat 'em ups at the time. Double Dragon on the NES for example lost its 2-player co-op feature, while Target Renegade on the other hand handles the 2 players and a bunch of enemies with little trouble. Frankly, this game was much better than anyone at the time probably thought was possible. I think it's fair to make the claim that Rex stands as the most underrated game on the spectrum. The game is a very polished platform shooter hybrid that has you navigating the huge levels, dispatching the enemies and exploring branching pathways searching for upgrade pods to improve your weaponry. Rex himself is an anthropomorphic rhino mercenary with a personal shield generator. This shield generator constitutes one of the game's most interesting elements. It can be turned on at any time and gives complete protection whilst active, but its battery runs down quickly, requiring you to recharge it at dedicated points. At first the game may look a little dated for 1988, but the clever play mechanics, carefully designed colour graphics and overall polish make for a truly classic and criminally underlooked game. The oldest game on the list, The Hobbit, released by Australian publisher Melbourne House, was the first game to appear on Spectrum that can be considered something of a killer app. The game is an excellent text adventure title based on the famous book, and was actually sold with the book included. It had an advanced parser for the time that allowed you to mess around a bit more than usual, and was one of the first to provide the player with in-game illustrations of the environment, which helped to make the game more immersive. The NPCs in the game also move around the world on their own, which can lead to a lot of different outcomes in the game. The Hobbit remains a fondly remembered title that spawned its own in-jokes among fans and is still worth giving a play today. Ocean and Graft Gold did a great job on most of their ports of Rainbow Islands, and the Spectrum version was no exception. The game is a very unique arcade platformer from Taito that has you firing off rainbows that can be used to attack the enemies or to make temporary platforms that can be walked on. Whilst there's a lot of colour clash here, the game still manages to be an attractive, colourful and enjoyable experience. Yet another classic strategy game from Julian Gollop, this time an expansion of his Rebel Star titles. The game has you taking turns moving your team around, firing off shots and trying to complete your mission against the computer player, or preferably a second player. It improved a lot on the elements laid out by Rebel Star, giving a lot more customization options, improved CPU AI and a bunch of excellent scenarios to play. School Days was a very unique and original concept that had you playing as a student attempting to get the combination of the school safe to steal your reports. This was achieved by shooting at the flags and then getting each of the teachers with your pea shooter in turn, all whilst avoiding getting into trouble. The game is another very early example of the sandbox genre, with you able to ignore the main goal and simply entertain yourself by just moving around a school, messing around and causing trouble. An important release that remains a lot of fun still to this day. This is an interesting open world driving game where you play as an undercover police officer trying to bust drug dealers. In the game you drive around the city with complete freedom, park into side roads waiting for deals to take place and then run said drug dealers off of the road. It's an ambitious concept for the time that many see as an early inspiration for later games like the popular Driver on PlayStation, which itself would go on to influence the mega popular 3D Grand Theft Auto games. This was a very important release in the history of gaming that likely doesn't get the credit it deserves. After the isometric adventure genre was popularised by Nightlaw, a glut of similar games started to appear in Britain, but it was the games of John Rittman and Bernie Drummond that truly took on the mantle from Ultimate, polishing and building on their groundwork beautifully. And Rare in turn ended up taking head over heels' dual character setup for their Banjo-Kazooie games. The influence is especially noticeable in the second game. Head Over Heels is the best isometric adventure game of the 80s bar none. An elegantly designed game containing a plethora of the cleverest puzzles seen in the genre, a huge, detailed and well realised world, some of the best pixel artwork out there, and clever game mechanics aplenty. The game has you helping the two protagonists, Head and Heels, escape from prison and join up with each other. From there on you are given a hub area filled with teleporters that send you to different planets, each of which has a crown to be stolen before you return. It's unfortunately quite a dated game and is too difficult as well. There's some fiendish pixel-perfect jumping here and there, and some of the less fair tropes of the genre remain. Treat all platforms with suspicion, as it's always possible that they might just disappear as soon as you land on them. But the game's originality and overall accomplishment at creating a living, breathing world to explore cannot be understated. Truth be told, it would probably be best for most people to experience the remake of the game though, which whilst not perfect itself, did have a bunch of quality of life improvements and some improved graphics as well. Everybody who's a fan of mid-80s games should definitely check this out. This was a pretty good port of one of the most important games of the decade. Elite is a wireframe 3D space trading and warfare game where you travel the stars buying and selling between planets, upgrading your spaceship, and getting into dogfights with pirates, all the lore, along the way. The game was a pioneer of non-linear, open-ended gameplay that gave the player a huge galaxy to explore and unparalleled amount of freedom and choice. The Spectrum version is a good port of the game. It moves a little slower than the original BBC version, but it's still one of the faster ports, has less flicker and had the inclusion of some new missions and a keyboard overlay to help get the player started. Chaos is a very minimalist looking but cleverly designed multiplayer strategy game made by the ever excellent Julian Gollop for the publisher Games Workshop, makers of the Warhammer tabletop game. Up to 8 players take turns in casting spells and calling forth creatures to fight for them and attack the other players. Definitely one of the best multiplayer party games of the entire era. Port of the classic horizontally scrolling shmup from Irem. For anyone not familiar with the series, R-Type's defining element was the inclusion of a power-up called the Force Pod. The Force Pod could be attached to the front or back of your ship, or fired off and manipulated to attack an enemy's weak spot. This element made the game rewarding to master and lent the title a lot of depth. So how did the Spectrum port turn out? Well, the Spectrum version of this game is, quite frankly, a tour de force of programming skill, and represents the zenith of what was achieved on the system. The game contains all of the gameplay elements of the arcade original, whilst managing some pretty smooth scrolling and colour graphics with little clash and numerous on-screen sprites to boot. It's a game that is so impressive that many likely found it hard to believe that what they were seeing was running on a stock Spectrum. Unfathomably good. Does Manic Miner really need an introduction? The game stands as one of the standout early titles for the Spectrum and one of the most beloved of early platform games. For the time, the game pushed the limits with its high number of distinctive levels and environments. At this time, memory constraints had really limited the amount of variety offered in platformers of the day. Earlier titles like Donkey Kong, for example, had only 4 stages that cycled through, and the home ports even often had to cut one of those 4 stages out. Manic Miner's other contemporaries, on the other hand, would facilitate a large number of levels by reusing the same art assets and enemies for every single stage. At a time when the NES had to cut its port of Donkey Kong down to 3 stages, Manic Miner was doing 20 individual levels, creating an imaginative, surreal and funny world full of unique, very well animated foes, like snapping mutant toilets and telephones, and pop culture references from video games and movies of the day. All this served to drive the player onwards just to see what the next screen would hold. So in the number 1 spot we have Lords of Midnight. This was a phenomenal Lords of the Rings inspired adventure / turn-based strategy game. One of the first truly epic feeling games to have ever been made. The game is you controlling multiple heroes as they traverse the land in a sort of first-person view, recruiting for your army and amassing a band of human and non-human heroes to join your troop. Along the way you can also discover legendary weapons to aid you in battles. And all the time this is going on, the computer player is amassing his own armies and directing them around the map. The ultimate goal in the game is to either find and destroy the Ice Crown, which is sort of like the One Ring I guess, or amass an army and attack Doomdark's Citadel. Both objectives require lots of exploration, and it's recommended that you map out the world yourself on paper so as to mark down points of importance and not get lost. The game was a Spectrum classic, large in scope and hugely ahead of its time. There was nothing like it at the time for bringing the player into its world, and it's still very playable even now. Well, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, then please like and subscribe, and maybe consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description. See ya!